What is going on, everybody, and welcome to my tutorial video where I'm going to be showing you how to create a simple dialogue system in Unity. In this video, we're going to be making a quick and easy dialogue system that's perfect for game jams, prototyping, and rapid game development. I'm currently doing a challenge where I create and release a full game each month, and in this video, I'm going to be showing you the dialogue system that I created for my game called Escape the DJ Booth. In fact, that game is available right now, and you can check it out in the link in the description below. In just a moment, I'll be showing off the dialogue system working in my game, and then going to be talking about some of the features and limitations of this dialogue system. And then we're going to take a deep dive into the code, and I'm going to show you exactly how it works. But before I do that, I'd just like to say if you find this video helpful, make sure you leave it a like, and also feel free to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. On this channel, I show you how to make games quickly and effectively as I create a new game each month. By the way, I will be having all relevant code and art assets online in just a little Unity package for you, so feel free to check the description below to go ahead and download that, and you can just import it right into your project. And so before going any further in this tutorial, I'd just like to say there are kind of a couple prerequisites. You should definitely be familiar with Unity and C# at this point and just kind of basic coding. We're not going to do anything too crazy, but we are going to be dealing with some delegates a little bit. And if you want a deeper explanation on what delegates are and how they work, I created another tutorial video, and you can definitely go check that out. The link will be up in the card and, of course, in the description below. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into the game here. So you see, here we are at the just home screen for Escape the DJ Booth. So let's just go ahead and hit the play button, and we can jump right into the game here. So of course, fades to black, and you know, what would a video game be without a little bit of a load times? So anyways, we fade in just kind of on this little smartphone screen here. We'll see that the Kablam's promoter is calling us now. So of course we can pick it up, or we can just, you know, hang up on him because we don't really want to talk to him, do we? Oh, well, he's calling back again. I guess it must be urgent, so we can pick this call up. And then so you'll see here we have our first look kind of at the dialogue display. Of course, you can fully customize this however you'd like. This is just kind of something I made in like 10 minutes just because I was going pretty quick here. Basically, the idea is you kind of have this top section where it says the name of the person who's talking, and then this bigger section on the bottom, this is kind of where the main text is. And of course, there's just a little button here that we can advance the text with. So you'll see now the promoter is talking. So I'm not going to like go through all this, but basically the idea of the game is this promoter kind of convinces you to become a DJ for the night, and he wants to know your DJ name. So at this point, one of the other features that I have in my dialogue system is it can actually take in a certain input here. You'll see that if we try and advance, it's not going to let us because we don't have anything entered in here. So of course, our DJ name is going to be DJ Turbo. All right, and then when we enter this, you'll see that a couple things happen here. You see that our name updates to DJ Turbo, and then kind of in the context here, it also says DJ Turbo within this text here. And so of course, once again, we have this DJ Turbo variable name popping up here. I mean, you could put anything you want in that input box and it'll show up here. And I'm going to be showing you how all that input works there. But because I made this game, I know that this is the last little bit of dialogue for this conversation. And then so when we push the next button, the conversation is going to be ended. And the way I have it programmed is it's going to kind of trigger a few events to happen here. So if we just press this next button, you'll see the dialog box goes away. The screen fades to black, and then fades in with the poster. And of course, we have the contextual DJ name here. Just whatever you put in will show up here. Okay, now we just kind of have a little bit of a panning shot of the outside. I can just kind of skip over this for now. And then just the last thing that I wanted to show off in game is I kind of have these things that I call one-liners set up. And it's basically, because this is kind of like an adventure type game, it's an escape the room type game, obviously. The players just kind of say these brief little one-line things every once in a while, like say if we try and interact with the door, you know, he just has this quick little one-liner, what the heck, why can't I get out of here? And it closes. And then also if you click on it again, it's just going to say it's still locked every time you click on it after that. So this is basically just kind of like one line dialogue that pops up. And for a game like this, it's kind of nice to have this just like one line dialogue just so you can spit out, you know, just brief little messages that kind of indicate to the player what's happening within the world. Because, you know, if that line didn't pop up, then the player might just be kind of like clicking on the door and not really understanding fully what is going on. But yeah, so that's basically kind of the dialogue system that I have set up so far. As I continue this 1 game a month challenge, I'm going to be building off this dialogue system and make it much more complex and much more functional as we go along. And there's definitely going to be some improvements that will be made. And as we get into the code, I'm going to be showing you how I do some things, and some things are, you know, maybe not the best coding practice or anything like that, but it definitely gets the job done for something quick and easy, and that is what we're going for in this tutorial video. All right, so now just going to pull up some of the code here. Actually, before I go any further, I would just like to pull up Unity real quick and just show off a couple of things. Basically, you'll see that this down here in the lower left, this is just the dialog box that we have. But essentially you just have this dialog canvas. Under it is the dialog box, which is this full box here. This is the actual image, and this is like kind of a transparent PNG image, so you can kind of see through it here. And then it consists of a couple Unity UI components. So here you just have the speaker name text at the top here. This text field you can see kind of spans this whole area here. You'll have the main dialog text, which spans kind of the main body right here. We have a button for the advanced dialog button. And then lastly, we have the dialog input field. So those are the main components. Again, I'll make a Unity package of this so you can just download it and import it right into your project. But we'll just jump right back into the code here. So I'm going to start off this code actually at the bottom of my script. This is, I just call it dialogcontroller.cs. And within this, I actually have another class called Dialog Object. And I have this system.serializable tag above it. That's mainly just kind of for debugging purposes, so we can see these variables within the editor, just in case we need to like check up on some things. And then so a dialog object is basically going to be the container for one single line of dialogue. Now, the dialogue can be a couple different types. Actually, at the top here, the top of this dialog controller script, I've defined this enum called dialog type. And so the 3 types we have are basic line, text input, and choice. So of course the basic line is just, you know, straight talking. You just have the person who's speaking and then the line that they're saying. Then the text input, you're going to have the person who's speaking, the line that they're saying, and then actually an input field. And then we'll get into some of the unique variables associated with that. And then I also wanted to have a choice type, and that's something that I haven't fully programmed yet, but it's just kind of a placeholder. This is going to be something that's coming soon. So anyways, for each dialog object, of course, it's going to have a dialog type. And if you're not familiar with this last little part, basically all it means is that from outside the object, we can get the type of it, but we can't change the type, just kind of a little bit of a security measure. Here we have a variable for the content type that is assigned to the input field. So if you're pretty familiar with Unity UI, you may be aware that input fields have an input type associated with them. And so that type can be like alphanumeric, where it will only be letters and numbers. You can't do symbols or spaces or anything like that. Or it'll be a password field where it'll just show the dots instead of the actual characters as you're typing it in. And I put that in there just so we can have different types of input to take in here, but it's not something that's super important. So we'll have a string for the speaker name, a string for the dialogue line, which is kind of the main text of what the person is saying. For the input, we're going to have the input placeholder text, and you'll see that the placeholder text right here, it just says enter text. But if you'll notice, when I played my game at the beginning in that first input field, it said enter DJ name. So it was kind of context specific, so we can configure that to be exactly what we want. Next is the maxed input length. So for example, the DJ name, I have a max input length of 16, and that's pretty self-explanatory. I have a public string array for dialogue choices. This kind of comes in, this doesn't really come into play right now, but this essentially will be in the future when there's going to be like multiple choices that you can select from. you basically will pass an array of the different choices that you can select. All right, now here's where things start to get a little bit interesting. We have these two delegates at the end here. So we have an enter input and a basic line call delegate. And again, these things are defined at the top of this dialog controller C# script. So you'll see that we've created a public delegate void called enter input, and it takes in a string value called input string. And then we also have a public delegate, which is of type void for basic line call. Now, in a nutshell, delegates are just like a reference to a function. So basically what happens is, for example, for the enter input, after we enter our input, this is the function that's going to be called, and we're going to pass in our input string to that function. If it doesn't really make sense, I'm going to be showing you exactly how it works later. But we'll scroll back down to our dialog object here. And so those are basically all the variables associated with that. Now we're going to get into some of the functions. And actually, there aren't really any functions. These are just all constructors. We have 4 different types of constructors. Basically, the first one, the most basic one, it just takes in a name and the dialog line, and all it does is assign the dialog type and assigns the speaker name, dialog line, and it sets basic line call to null. The next thing is very similar, but it basically just takes in a basic line call delegate, and it basically does the same thing, sets it to a basic line, and just assigns that basic line call value. So the next one might look a little bit more complicated, but really it's not that bad. This is basically just for the text input dialog types, and it just wants a couple more values. So again, it takes in a string for the name of the person who's speaking, a string for the line that they're saying, and then it takes in the content type that you want to have. It'll also take in a string for the placeholder text, maximum length, and then the actual callback function that's going to be called after you enter the input in. And then it basically just sets all the variables to what you assigned it in. And then lastly, we just have the dialog type of choice. Again, this doesn't really do anything for now. This was just kind of me testing around and just kind of doing some debug statements, more of a placeholder than anything at this point. Alrighty, so starting at the top of the code here, we just have these static instances of the dialog controller. This just makes it so we can access this script from any other script within our project. The only other thing we have to do to set that up is just kind of do these couple lines here. So just make sure there's only one instance of this dialog controller in existence in the whole project. So next, I already showed off the enter input and basic line delegates. After that, we have one more delegate called the Dialog Delegate. Basically, we just have a delegate variable called Dialog, and this is what's called once the current dialog conversation has ended. And so that's how we can kind of trigger some extra behavior to happen. So like, for example, at the beginning, when that conversation finished, that triggers the whole screen fading to black and then fading in on the poster and then fading in on the outside of the nightclub and then finally fading into the actual DJ booth itself. And I have other conversations that sort of happen throughout my game, and then at the end of them, kind of some special behavior triggers that's obviously completely different than loading the game in the first place. And so with this Dialog Delegate, we can assign any function to this, and then once the dialog conversation is over, that function will be called. So next, I just have a few lists of dialog objects. So for example, this first list is just called the current conversation list, and this is just kind of the container that the current conversation gets loaded into, and then we can always look at that current conversation to see kind of where we are at in that conversation. Next, I have a couple more of these dialog object lists, and these are for specific conversations in my game. It's probably not the best coding practice to kind of have these conversations sitting in the dialog controller, but again, we're going for the quick and easy approach right now. So I showed off before the dialog type enum. Next, we have a dialog object for the current dialog object. Again, that's just a reference to the current dialog object. Pretty self-explanatory there. And then here we have game objects for the dialog canvas, speaker name text, dialog input field text, and advanced dialog button. These are all basically just the Unity UI elements that are in our game here. And then the last two things, I just have a public string for the DJ name. In the code I'm providing you, I think I'll just change the name of that to like main character or something like that. Basically, all that happens is it's just, the name of the main character, so you have a reference to that. So you can input that variable in. So whatever the player chooses their name to be, you can always just have a reference to that name. And then lastly, we have the dialogue index. Basically, as you'll see, when we're going through the conversation, it'll kind of iterate through each of these lists. And so this dialogue index keeps track of kind of where we were and then where we're going to be in the conversation. So again, that's kind of one of the other limitations of this dialogue controller, is it doesn't really support like branching paths or anything like that. As you'll see that I have that kind of choices thing in there, I do plan to add sort of branching paths as we go along here. But for now, it's basically all just straight linear text, next line, next line, next line. So anyways, moving down to the awake function here, you'll see that this first part basically just makes sure that we only have one instance of the dialogue controller script. The rest of the stuff here is basically just setting up variables, finding these variables within our scene, and just kind of basic stuff like that. As we go to the start function, this initializes our lists, and it starts calling some of our functions to actually set up the dialogue conversations. So here you'll see that we have this first conversation, and this was the conversation that I showed off at the beginning of this video. So basically, all that's happening is we're just creating these new dialogue objects. So we'll just have dialogue object line 1 equals new dialogue object. And then of course you're going to pass in the person who's speaking. And just for now, before we inputted the DJ's name, we just have it say you. But you'll see as we move on, we'll change this to the DJ's actual name. And this of course is the text they're saying. So then next the promoter speaks. And then, the promoter has a line, and then it kind of goes back and forth a little bit. And then you'll see the last thing that we have for this first conversation here. This last line, this is where the promoter asks what the DJ's name is. And because we want an input field to pop up, we'll pass in the input field of content type .standard. And then this is the placeholder text where it says enter DJ name. We're going to have a maximum of 16 characters. And then the function that we want to call after we input it is the enter DJ name function. So real quickly, I can just scroll down to that function. So here we have the enter DJ name function. Of course, it takes in a string for the entered name, and it just sets our DJ name variable to entered name. And then what it does next is it calls the setup phone call part 2 dialog. So let me scroll up to that. So hopefully I don't lose you guys here, because this kind of gets a little bit confusing, but basically this is kind of the second part of that phone call. As you'll remember, this is where the DJ actually says his name. And you'll see this time around we have DJ name as a variable. Instead of just saying you, we have the variable DJ name. And then the string, it says, let's go with, again, we'll have the variable DJ name here. And then the promoter also says contextually the DJ's name here. Now, the reason I kind of had to do this like 2-part phone call type thing, originally I just kind of had this all in one thing. But basically what happens is when we call the setup phone call dialog and all these different lines get added to that phone call dialog, well, when we do that, we don't have the DJ's name yet. So what happens is it just enters a blank string in there. So even though we update this DJ name variable later on, when we initially set it up, it just had a blank string in there. So it just remembers that blank string, which is obviously what we don't want to happen. So that's kind of the reason why we split this dialogue out into 2 sections here. So again, there's kind of something where it's, there probably is a better solution for that, but this is a quick and easy, and it definitely works. And so I didn't really mention, but essentially what happens is we create all these different lines and we add them to the phone call dialog list. Basically pretty straightforward there. So now we're actually going to have this start phone call function, and this is triggered when we hit the accept call button, the green answer button, kind of in that opening sequence there. So what it does is it calls this change cur conversation, and it passes in the phone call dialog. So this is just that phone call dialog list that we added all the lines to. And then it also wants the end dialog delegate. So we'll call the start phone call 2, which is going to be what's triggered after the first phone call ends. So that's why you don't really notice that there are two different conversations, because when the first one ends, the second one is immediately started. And then after that, we just have this show dialog function passing in the current dialog object. So now let's go down and I'll show you how these change cur conversation and show dialog functions work. So here we have the change cur conversation, and it's pretty simple. Of course, it takes in a list of dialog objects. We'll just call that new conversation. And it wants the end dialog delegate. Here we just have it called _ end dialog. So all it does is it sets our end dialog variable. And you'll remember that end dialog variable is defined at the top here. This is just a delegate to be called once the dialog has ended. So it sets that up. What this line here does is it just clears out anything that's in the current conversation, because the current conversation basically just looks at these different lists and says like, hey, this is kind of the new dialog that I need. We don't want any previous dialogue kind of confusing the whole current conversation thing. So all this first line does is it clears out that. So we do that by doing current conversation.remove range from 0, and then the number is current conversation.count, the number of things to remove. Now the next thing we do is we do current conversation.add range, and we pass in new conversation. So this is that new conversation variable here. And so whenever we want to change the conversation, this is where we take that conversation that we want to be the new conversation and we pass it into the current conversation, if that makes sense. Because this is a new conversation, we're going to reset our dialog index back to 0, so we can start at the beginning of that new conversation. And then we'll set the current dialog object to the current conversation at position dialog index, which is 0, which is the first line in the conversation. So that basically just it gets everything ready for the new conversation. Now the show dialog is where things start to get a little bit more complicated, because we kind of have to handle the different cases of if we're just displaying a basic line, if we're displaying a choice or an input type of dialog line. So for show dialog, it just takes in a dialog object called line. Of course, dialog object is that custom class that we made, which just represents a single line of dialogue. So what it does is it sets the whole dialog canvas to true. So it displays this whole picture here. All right, the next thing it does is it sets the input field to false. And the reason we do that is because we can't guarantee that we're going to be having an input type being shown. If we are, we'll just be turning that back on in a second, so that's no problem. We'll set the speaker's name.text to the line.speaker_name. We'll set the dialog text.text to the line.dialog line. So we're literally looking at the dialog object, and then we're going to be changing the text in this speaker name here to the speaker's name of that specific dialog object. And of course, we'll be changing the kind of main body of that as well. This line is just part of my game. You don't need to worry about that. You won't have that in the code that I'm providing you. Now here we have a switch case, and this is what handles the different types of dialog input. So we'll do switch line.dialog type. So this looks at the dialog type for this specific dialog object. So for each case, we'll have a couple different things that happen. So the first case is dialog type.basicLine. So again, this is just basic line. It just has the person who's speaking and what they're saying. So the only thing we need to do for this is I have this basic line called delegate. There's literally one case where I'm doing a basic line call, and I want something to happen at the same time that is being displayed. And I can actually show you that right now because it's kind of a cool thing here. All right, so without giving too much away about my game, there's one point you kind of have this like webcam conversation with the promoter. And then, so what happens is we'll hit the next button, and one more time, and you'll see that he kind of goes, and the whole screen shakes like crazy. Right, and that is all happening while this dialogue is being displayed. So it's not being triggered by the end state of this conversation, but rather when this particular line of dialogue is shown for the first time. So that's basically all that does. For dialog type of choice, because I don't have this fully implemented, there's nothing there. For the type of text input, this is kind of where we set all the setup. We take that dialog input field, we'll set it active, we'll turn it back on. We'll set the content type, the character limit. We'll clear out the text in case there was any text there previously from a previous input. And then we'll set the placeholder text. And then this last thing I do is select. So when it's shown, it's already going to have the cursor there so the player can just start typing right away. And then lastly, in the switch case, we just kind of have this error in case for some reason the dialog type gets set to some weird unknown type, and we can just kind of debug that here. And I'm just now noticing that I have this in here twice. I don't think there's any reason for that. So you won't have that in your code. So that's kind of the basics of showing different types of input and showing them up on the screen. The next thing I'm going to show you is how we can kind of progress through the conversation. So you'll remember that we kind of have this advanced dialogue button here, and it's basically just this little button with an arrow on it. And so you kind of see here that we have for the on click for this, we'll set this to the dialog controller.advanced dialog function. So when we go back here, we just have this pretty simple advanced dialog function here. And so this does a couple of things here. So the first thing it does is it checks if the current dialog object is of type text input. And if it is, then it does this kind of check for input. And so if you'll remember kind of at the beginning when it prompted us to type in a DJ name and we didn't have anything entered, you could hit the next button all you wanted and it doesn't actually advance the dialogue. So basically what happens is if there's no input, this check for input function fails, and then we just return out of this function so the dialog doesn't progress any further. And if you're curious, here's the actual check for input function. All it does is it looks at the dialog input field and checks to see if the length is greater than 0. If it is, it returns true. If it doesn't, it returns false. The other thing it does, which it says that to do, probably not the smartest idea to have here. This is where the current dialog object callback is called. So just kind of scrolling up to show this off again. For this here, when we set up this input field and we set up the enter DJ name kind of as the input callback, this right here in the check for input function is where that is actually called. So it works just fine, but it's probably not best to have that in here. We would want to kind of separate that out ideally, but we're going for the quick and easy right now. And I know I keep saying that we're doing the quick and easy and this video is going a little bit long, but so I'm kind of a hypocrite there. Sorry about that, but I'm going to be wrapping this up pretty soon once I show off these last couple things here. All right, so advanced dialogue. The next thing we check for is if the current conversation.count is equal to 0. That means if there's no current conversation happening, it just hides the dialogue. And so the reason this is here is the next thing that I'm going to be showing off, which is kind of those like one-liner things that I was talking about. In that case, we clear out the current conversation and there's no current conversation. We don't use current conversation for those one-liners. And when we click the next button to advance the dialogue, because there's no current conversation, there's no next dialogue, all we do is call this hide dialog function and just return out of this function. Otherwise, we can proceed. So what we'll do is we'll increment the dialog index. We'll of course check if the dialog index is greater than or equal to the count of the current conversation, meaning that the dialogue has ended. There's no more lines to say in the current conversation. If that is the case, again, we're going to hide the dialogue. And if we have a function assigned to the Dialog Delegate, we will call that Dialog Delegate. So this is where we actually call the Dialog function that we kind of set up during that change conversation function. And so because the dialogue has ended in this case, we will return out of the function. And then these last two lines, this is only if there is something new to show. All it does is it reassigns the current dialog object to the current conversation at the new dialog index, which we incremented right here. So this is just the next line in the list. And then we'll call the show dialog function once again, passing in this new current dialog object. And so real quickly, I can just show you what this hide dialog function does. All it does is it clears out the speaker's name, dialog name, and turns the dialog canvas off. So pretty straightforward there. All right, now these last one-liners are the last two things that I'm going to be showing you, I promise. So here we have the public void for DJ one-liner, and it just takes in a string variable called line. And because we can guarantee that the DJ is the one who's speaking, you know, we don't need to know the person who's speaking. Of course, because this is a public function, we can call this from anywhere in my script. So there are a couple other places within my code where I call these DJ one-liner functions, and then we set the end dialog to null because we don't have any of that. And then so here what we do is we'll create a new dialog object, passing in the DJ name and the line they're saying, and we'll assign that to the current dialog object and just call show dialog on the current dialog object. And very similar to that, we have DJ input one-liner, and the only difference for this is not only does it take in a string for what the player has to say, but it also takes in a string for the placeholder text that will be shown in the input field. Again, that's just kind of this little input field, the gray text here. And then it has an enter input delegate for what happens when we do enter the function. So again, pretty similarly, it sets up a new dialog object, but with these specific input field type names. But this function basically just does the same thing as the last one, but instead of setting up a basic line, we're setting up an input line. And so anyways, I think that's just about all I would like to show you for this. Of course, if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below. I'd be more than happy to clarify anything with you. I'm just going to kind of edit this code a little bit so to give you all the relevant stuff and make it a little bit more kind of generic and specific to any application. That's going to be a Unity project, so you can just go ahead and download that and import it into your project. And fingers crossed you can kind of start using that right away. So anyways, if you found this video helpful, and I certainly hope you did, make sure you leave it a like. Also feel free to subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already, so you can check out lots more of my videos on making games quickly and effectively. Of course, you can check out my blog at turbomakesgames.com, where I kind of do a deeper written dive into some of these topics, and I think you might find them quite interesting. But with that, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.